Hello and welcome YouTube, my name is Drewlik and I have read The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson. It's the original, it's the OG. If I should describe it with one word, I would say surprised. Surprised that a lot of the elements that have been ingrained into our culture were not present. It was instead a delightfully grounded exploration of human nature. There were some fantastical elements, as you would expect from a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, but I think that the entire narrative and the concept has been utterly hijacked and placed into a purely nonsensical idea of the brute strength of a Mr. Hyde and, the genius of a mad scientist gone wrong called Dr. Jekyll, when it wasn't present in the original novella. Modern reimaginings of the characters feature them to be brutish monsters who transform when they get angry, like a Hulk, because incidentally Hulk was inspired by Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and then, through some cross-semination it has happened that it re-inspired itself. So in essence everything came full circle and, the character got more and more distorted from its original conception. In its original conception, it is a metaphor for duality of man. At least this is the way I read it. And it does a tremendous job at it. I cannot sing my praise high enough for this. The English is at times difficult to read. It is a turn-of-the-century novella, and some words have fallen out of use, I do have to say. What is wrong with you people? It's just plain English. Read it! Get used to it! But if you arm yourself with a thesaurus, you should have no problem even reading the more archaic English. For example, there is a lot of ebulliating going on. Now, this is something that is today only used in a very technical sense, if something is at its boiling point. And back in the day, it was just the technical term for boiling, and it was a lot more common and a lot better understood than it is today. So there's a lot of ebulliating going on, some very interesting words that were particular to the Victorian society of the day, but you get the gist of it. If you have only the slightest hint of knowledge of the Victorian era, everything should become pretty clear out of context. It's not that hard, it's still English. Of course it changes over time. Imbeciles. So it is an easy read. It was intended for the masses back in the day. It does at times almost read like a philosophical dissertation, but it is kept so light that you can understand it, and I cannot give it enough praise for that. I think this is why it is so deeply ingrained in our culture, why it stuck so much. I think in a review I read that the original shock value of the things being described within the novella were the reason why it sold so well as a shilling novel, little paperback things you would just toss out onto the street as a cheap read. But it gained quite some traction, and it put out some very interesting ideas. In essence, the book is kind of a whodunit. It is a discovery of the crimes. It is revealed only at the very end what has been going on all along. Now, I do have to say that I have been spoiled by the culture, so you could perhaps call it a cultural spoiler in sorts. The fact that Dr. Jekyll is Mr. Hyde and Mr. Hyde is Dr. Jekyll is only revealed in the very last chapter, a letter towards his very dear friend where he confesses all of the crimes he has committed while he was under the influence of Mr. Hyde. And it comes as a great big shock, when of course it doesn't. We already know this. If I have told you that this was the big reveal at the book, you would be quite disappointed. But I still found it to be a very enjoyable read. The book begins with a recounting of a conversation that our protagonist, Mr. Utterson, has with his cousin. They talk about the strange dealings of a strange man emerging from a large door near the office of a mutual friend, Dr. Jekyll, and this figure almost ran over and trampled a young girl. He did not stop for her. Only when people on the street stopped him, he was being held accountable, and he had to pay £100 in old English currency, which is quite a fortune, for it not to be a scandal. So he was very ungentlemanlike. He should have hurt her more. He should have trampled on her face, kicked her in the liver, made it so that she would never walk again. When he was done with her, her mother ought to not have recognized her anymore. During the book, a person is killed, the Dr. Jekyll becomes increasingly reclusive, and you are left wondering what is actually going on. Dr. Jekyll seems to have a relationship with Mr. Hyde, and does vouch for him, and even gives out his money to him, and covers him, and told his servants that they are to obey Mr. Hyde as if he were Mr. Jekyll. Some interesting foreshadowing here, done by our very jolly author. And, because Dr. Jekyll was such a respectable member of their community, they thought, well, something has to be going on with Mr. Hyde, and he probably is blackmailing him and knows some secret of Mr. Jekyll, and they really beg him and implore him to confide with them, what it is, so they can get rid of this ghastly Mr. Hyde, when in reality what has been going on all along was that his dark side finally emerged. There was a serum which he took, which was ebullierating a lot, and this serum made him into the alter ego, Mr. Hyde. Over time, he loses control over his alter ego, and even without taking the mixture, he turns into him, and then he needs the mixture and this concoction to turn back into Dr. Jekyll, and it just gets increasingly worse as time goes, because he's been so infatuated with being Mr. Hyde, and he just wanted it so much. And he describes this in the very last chapter, what his thought process was like. The last chapter also is incidentally the longest one, because all of the reasoning have to be explained post hoc, so after the fact. After the whole book takes place, you have to retroactively explain what has been going on in actuality. So this is what I mean when I said it's kind of a whodunit, and that you are actually majorly spoiled by your culture through knowing that they are the same person. In the end, the book devolves into a discussion of traits, and it becomes a very literal representation of the duality of man. So let's get more into the themes of the novel. What I found really fascinating about this is the realization I had that people really need a very good metaphor. Now, the duality of man is not a new invention or a new concept. People since the antique period and before that have been coming to gripes with the fact that humans can create and destroy simultaneously. That's my interpretation of the duality of man. Of course, it can mean a lot of things. It could mean good versus evil, the eternal struggle of doing the right thing versus doing the wrong thing. For me, it is about the capacity for destructive behavior and productive behavior. The one who can build can inherently also destroy. It is within his power. If you are an actor in the world and you make a meaningful difference, then you can use this particular power of creation for good or for bad, or for destruction or construction. And this is what I mean when I say the duality of man, but of course, interpretations can vary. And he does something very intelligent here. He uses literally two different people who are the same person and merges them into one. Now, this has been something that has been done, of course, in the past, because people do not accurately grasp this concept enough. Maybe the people lack the faculties to think that abstractly, and they can't really handle it, and they need this visual metaphor of someone being literally two persons. But it stuck with a lot of people. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is now synonymous for being two-faced, and even the word two-faced is a metaphor. There are some Mesopotamian gods, back from 10,000 years ago, that literally have two faces. You cannot overstate how important visual metaphor is for people to wrap their heads around things that are too abstract for them to understand. So if someone is simultaneously benevolent, well-meaning and good, but can also be evil, vindictive and cruel, then he is two-faced. He has two faces. One time he shows this one face, and the other time he shows the other face. So he has two faces. Or on the case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, he has an alter ego. He has an entirely different personality. And interestingly enough, within the book, he even allows for more fragments of personality to integrate within that. So he talks that he, of course, can only talk of two, but we might all be an amalgamation of different fragments of our personality that are all struggling to be integrated into one whole thing. And you know what? A few decades later, Freud and Jung come along and precisely confirm and elaborate on that theory, and they were very smart minds in the world of personality. So without wanting to cast any blame on people unable to abstract such concepts, I can't believe how dumb you people actually are. Just use your head for once. Use your noggin, that's what it's there for. Be intelligent for once. Understand it. Don't need everything to be chewed up for you again and again. What are you, some sort of cow? Chew everything 4 times? Make a picture? You need some crayons to paint that picture for you? Why don't you understand it? And if you're really that dumb, just be intelligent. Might as well off yourself, because you're not adding anything of value to humanity. What's next? Should I explain this metaphor to you as well? Yes, I'm Hyde Drewlik. You got it, dude. Buzz off. Done with explaining obvious things to vastly inferior people. I more found it interesting than pathological that people really needed these visual metaphors. I can just off the top of my head can think about duplicity in a multitude of ways. The wolf in sheep's clothing. You immediately have another visual metaphor for what is going on. There's a wolf hiding within the sheep. So he's dangerous, but he appears docile. He is something that is distinctly disparate, but at the same time he embodies both of it. He quintessentially is a contradiction. And this contradiction has been so beautifully captured in this novel that it has stuck with us for 140 years. So even in these modern days, you would still instantly know what it means to be Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. This is the cultural impact that this particular work had. Again, I can only speculate on why people are like this, but I don't think that this is important. I think it's more important to realize that people are like this, and that you should probably use more visual metaphors for your abstract concepts, because it would be a lot easier for people to wrap their heads around it. I enjoyed it a lot because it was once again very Victorian. It had some criticism against the ruling classes back in the day. You know, the idea of that very esteemed gentleman can be lustful, sinful, and even bad, when such a thing was unthinkable and unfathomable. You couldn't even speak such an opinion. And yet the book did, and did this very cleverly and hidden, and had its criticism laid out very overtly, but also kind of subtly. It managed to walk a tightrope in that way, and I'm very impressed. I could not do something like that. What is that damn fool talking about? I could write a book that's 10 times better than that. I want to end this by reading a passage that particularly struck me. It is at the very end where he explains himself to his friends and colleagues who have been wondering what has been going on with Dr. Jekyll all of this time. And indeed, the worst of my faults was a certain impatient gaiety of disposition, such as has made the happiness of many, but such as I found it hard to reconcile with my imperious desire to carry my head high and wear a more than commonly grave countenance before the public. Hence it came about that I concealed my pleasures, and that when I reached years of reflection, and began to look round me and take stock of my progress and position in the world, I stood already committed to a profound duplicity of me. Many a man would have even blazoned such irregularities as I was guilty of, but from the high views that I had set before me, I regarded and hid them with an almost morbid sense of shame. It was thus rather the exacting nature of my aspirations than any particular degradation in my thoughts that made me what I was, and with even a deeper trench than in the majority of men severed in me those provinces of good and ill which divide and compound man's dual nature. In this case I was driven to reflect deeply and inveterately on that hard law of life which lies at the root of religion and is one of the most plentiful springs of distress. Through so profound a double-dealer I was in no sense a hypocrite. Both sides of me in dead earnest. I was no more myself when I laid aside restraint and plunged in shame than when I laboured in the eye of day at the furtherance of knowledge of the relief of sorrow and suffering. This is what I mean when I say it almost reads like a philosophical discourse. The end really shows a man who is completely broken and ridden with guilt about what he has done. He has tried to live his life with temperance and virtue, but he found himself to be hollow, and then, through years of pushing back his darker and deeper desires, he realized that there was a part of him he has never integrated into his character, and he describes this in the passage I just read. And then he got curious. He let them out. And in essence, both of these parts were him. None was wrong or more true than the other. Both of them were equally valid, even though one was abhorrent and one would be considered virtuous by society. It is this duality of man that he tried to understand when he went about his experimentation. I think the author has very cleverly found something that resonates within all of us and brought it to paper. Even better, he has brought it into an image that even the common man can understand. Alright, that's all for this video. My name is Drewlik, and as always, have a good one.
Do you want to know how I got these scars?
Honey, do I look different?